what everyone expected or what they thought about was going to happen in the future. Time frame, 70-week, Great Tribulation, lots of different ideas out there. I was raised thinking and being taught one way. As I've gotten older and studied and kind of come to my own decisions, I've thought another way. So as we go through this, we're going to be looking at all the things to come, the way society is going to change, the way that the government is going to change as we continue to go towards the end of the Great Tribulation and well before and to its buildup. We're going to talk about the rapture. We're also going to talk a little bit about how Russia, the Arab world, and the Middle East all fit into this. Here's going to be a worksheet. It's going to be coming around, and we're going to dive into this. We've got 20 slides to cover. It's one of those lessons, and as I told you when we started, that there's going to be times when we have to get into a little bit of depth, so as we go forward, you will have a more complete understanding of what we're talking about. Because if I just said Daniel's 70th week to some people who haven't studied the Word, they may not understand completely what I'm talking about. So we're going to look at that vision, we're going to look at that prophecy this morning, and then as we go forward, when I reference that over and over again through the next 3 months of this series, you will understand exactly what I'm talking about and why we rely on Daniel's 70th week. I'm going to start these around, pass them around, and we'll go from there. Give me one, too, if you don't mind. So as these come around, let's talk a little bit about what you remember about Daniel. What is it specifically from your childhood that you can say about Daniel? Ah, that's a big one, isn't it? Yeah, what else do you know about Daniel?
His faith is pretty awesome.
His what?
He's got good faith.
He's got good faith, yeah, that's good. Anything else that you could possibly think of Daniel as being? Daniel was a very interesting character. He was of royal blood, as a matter of fact, because he was of the tribe of Judah. And he was deported when he was 19 to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you remember, he lived in Babylon the entire time of his adult life, from 19 until probably the mid-90s. Because the whole time Israel was in Babylonian captivity for how many years? Does anybody know how many years Israel was in Babylonian captivity? 70, which was prophesied by Nebuchadnezzar. By Nehemiah. 70 years of which was going to happen there in Babylon. The Israelites were in captivity. He was probably in his teens, like I said, when he was exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, and then he was up into his 90s when he had his last prophetic vision. Now, there are suggestions that Daniel was around 22 when he had the dream of Nebuchadnezzar and that statue. How many of you can remember the prophecy of the statue, where it was made out of a gold head, and by the time you got down to the feet, there were different mixtures. It was actually mixing clay and bronze, maybe, or something like that. I can't remember exactly. We're going to get into that a little bit as in the next couple of weeks when I talk about the structure of the world going forward, what we're going to look for as we approach that Great Tribulation time, and what the dynamic of the world and maybe some of the European Union is going to look like. And I think that's what I know it is. That's where we're going to get into that statue of Nebuchadnezzar and his dream there. Like I said, he was about 22. He was under 4 different kings of Babylon, and he was an advisor to those kings. He read dreams. Many things happened. He was 87, as a matter of fact, when King Belshazzar summoned him to explain all the writings on the wall, if you'll remember that. And then 92 was about the time when he actually died. He wrote. It was the time that he wrote the closing vision of his book. The prophecies in Daniel are recorded in great detail. And what's amazing about Daniel, and when we look back, we can see that those prophecies that he said in the book of Daniel have been meticulously, and I say that, meticulously fulfilled in history. Meticulously fulfilled. There can be no doubt that his interpretations and what we're going to be studying here were inspired visions from God. Okay? No doubt whatsoever. I told you last week when we were talking about even the prophecy of Tyre, the city of Tyre, how exact that came to be. So, the 70-week prophecy is one of the most significant and detailed Masonic prophecies of the entire Old Testament. How many of you can say that you have heard about the 70-week prophecy? Raise your hand. It's amazing to me when you start talking about biblical prophecy and where things are coming in and falling in timeline, how many people have not heard this? Where we get our idea of the Great Tribulation Period. There's two places in the Bible that's going to happen. Jesus' prophetic Olivet discourse in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, and then also here in Daniel. Two places that we see what's going to happen during the last times. In chapter 9 of Daniel, you'll find this 70-week prophecy. It begins with Daniel earnestly praying for Israel and acknowledging that the nation of Israel, their sins against God, and asking God's mercy on that nation. Now, as Daniel prayed, something significant happened. Does anybody know what happened? The angel Gabriel appeared to him, and he gave him a vision of what's coming for Israel. Daniel was very old when he got this vision. He had known from scriptures in Jeremiah 25 and 11, all the way up to 29, 4 through 10, that it had come time for God to fulfill his promises concerning the ending of the Babylonian captivity. God told him specifically that it was going to be 70 years. Guess how many years it had been? 70 years. Daniel had absolute faith that God was going to fulfill that prophecy, and the time had come to do it. And so here we find Daniel on his knees praying about what was going to happen. And Daniel had, like I said, he had no doubt that they were literally going to be fulfilled. So he gave himself earnestly to prayer. He sat and he prayed. I don't know, some people, I was reading a couple of commentators this week. Some people said it was 3 o'clock. He prayed for several days, maybe even weeks. He had already seen this Persian era had dawned. It had been in prophecy. King Darius the Mede was installed on Babylon. He knew the exact signs, and it was time for that 70-year captivity to end. But so far, God hadn't done anything. And hence now he gets this spiritual exercise that he's going to meet the angel Gabriel to give him exactly what's going to happen to Israel's future. So here it is. Starting in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. The new prophecy that God entrusted to Daniel had to do, and keep in mind when I say this, there's going to be a couple of key points here as we go forward that we're going to hang on to this entire 3-month period, that he had to do primarily with the period which the Jewish people were actually going to be living in the promised land. This prophecy, I'm going to say it one more time, has to do with the Jewish people and when they're actually going to be living in the promised land. How long has it been since the Jews have lived in the promised land? It's been a really long time, up until about 1948. 1948. Been a really, really long time. And so we've kind of got the beginning of a little bit of hope here. So that's an important clue when we begin to understand this prophecy. So I'm going to read it. 70 weeks. 70 weeks are decreed about your people. He's speaking to Daniel. Gabriel is speaking to Daniel and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Notice the word here translated, or notice the word weeks, 70 weeks. Weeks here in this particular prophecy has to do with a period of 7 years. 1 week equals 7 years. Almost all commentators agree on that. Almost anybody you talk to will agree on that. Weeks of years. So when you have that interpreted, you have, in other words, we're looking at a period of 400 years. These verses provide us a very important clock. It gives us an idea of when the Messiah is going to come, what events we can show to see as accompanying of his appearance. And so all of that is going to boil down. Now we're going to break this down a little bit more. Here it is in a formula, 7 times 70. So we had 70 weeks. If each one of them equals 7, that's 490-year period. The significance of the period was going to begin with a very specific date when we talk about these 490 years. It was to run from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. A very specific date from when these 70 weeks was going to start. So the word going out, or the command to restore and build Jerusalem. Gabriel said here that clock is going to start, and it's going to start by a decree to rebuild that town of Jerusalem. So we have to look at timelines in history when a possible starting point could begin. So let's look at 4 possible starting points, and we have to decide which one of these begin with. Because there are commentators out there are people who are going to say, no, it was started with this date. But I'm going to show you exactly why we believe that it starts with a particular date and ends with a particular date. There have been 4 decrees in history for the Jews to be able to rebuild Jerusalem. The first one being the Decree of Cyrus, which we read in Ezra chapter 1, 1 through 4. And that happened in 538 BC. The second one we could possibly look at was the Decree of Darius I knew I was going to mess it up here. Histopses in 519 BC. The third one, the Decree of Artaxerxes in 456 BC. And that's in Ezra chapter 7, verse 11 and 22. And finally, the last one was the Decree of Artaxerxes, 445 BC. All 4 of these decrees issued by kings to go back and rebuild Israel or Jerusalem. However, there's a big stark difference between 3 of them as opposed to number 4. The first 3 prophetic decrees were actually very much political in nature, where the 4th one was actually the first 3 were religious and the last one was of a political nature. So when we look at this, the only one that matches up with the prophecy that Daniel looked at being under very great trouble, and I'm going to show you that in just a few minutes, to rebuild the wall, the only one that fits into that criteria is in 445 BC. That's, what were we going to say? 445 BC. In executing those provisions, you can see Nehemiah, when he went out to rebuild the wall, he ran into serious opposition, just like chapter 9 in Daniel says. So now the prophecy goes on to divide these 70 weeks into 3 smaller units. What are they? Up on the board. So we've got 3 smaller units. He divides it out first into 7 weeks. That's the first unit. The second one is 62 weeks. And the final one is 1 week. Those 70 weeks are divided into 3 smaller units. So now we have to figure out why in the world did Daniel divide out these 70 weeks into smaller units. So let's go back to that 445 BC starting point. So if we start off with 445, which fits in with the vision that Daniel had in Nehemiah going out to rebuild Jerusalem, then if we start that date of 7 years, 7 weeks, plus that 62 weeks, plus 1, obviously equals, that runs us into, or if we expressed it into the first 2 periods, 434 weeks, or 490 years total. Now then, so why did he divide out the first from the rest? The first 7 weeks is a little confusing. I had to do quite a bit of studying on why in the world Daniel divided it out in that way. Any ideas? Is there a significance that you can remember or think of that possibly from 49 years from the time of Daniel, 49 years from the time of Daniel that God might want to separate out those first 7 weeks, or those first, that first 7 weeks. As you look at Daniel, and you look at the Bible, and you just kind of flip through there, is there any kind of division in the Bible after Daniel before you get to something? What's after Malachi? Oh, okay, yeah, there you go. The New Testament. Very good, very good. So, the first one takes us down, if we look at about a 49-year period, takes us to the prophet Malachi, with which the Old Testament canon, the scripture from that point forward, is closed. God no longer talks to people. We have a period, a very long period between then and between Christ's first coming, that he's silent. So on that day, after Malachi, God had no more to say to man until the coming of Christ. That is my theory. That's what I think. That's what many commentators go with. Another theory was it took them about 49 years to actually build Jerusalem with streets and moats in a time of trouble. I don't know. It really seems like both of them maybe could even coincide, to where you could see that both of them, it took about 49 years to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. It also took 49 years till we got to the ending where God had no more to say to man until the second coming of Christ. Two theories there. Both of them could coincide, but I cannot come up with how long it took to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. 49 years seems to be a good date, but there is no hard set facts about that. But we knew, though, the time frame is 49 years from Daniel's prophecy to Malachi. So then, now that we have the first 7 weeks out of the way, we have to add the second period of 62 weeks to that. So now we have a period of 434 years. And we get, we add 434 weeks to the first 7, 49, we get 483 years. At which point, what is going to happen? So he says, know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one. Say it a little louder. He comes on the 69th week, which is very interesting when we look at this prophecy. 483 years, it says the anointed one would be cut off. So this is of great significance, because now we have a starting point, 445, and now we have an ending point. And it just so by chance is that when we look at the starting point of Artaxerxes' decree in 445 BC, and you add 483 years to that, guess where it gets you if you use the Jewish calendar of 360 days? Pretty significant that now we have an exact starting point and an exact ending point to the 69th week and from the beginning. 445 BC to the time of Christ's triumphal entry equals 483 years. Jesus came into Jerusalem, and in just a little while he would be completely cut off. So that leaves the final week, that final little pesky week that we have to talk about. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for a half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations, I may have misspelled that. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decree end is poured out on the desolator. 69 of these weeks have been fulfilled exactly as what Daniel had said. we are now living in that gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. Does anyone want to know or guess at what we call this current age that we live in? Something has happened in this age from the day of Pentecost until now that we live in an age called, any ideas? Not quite. The church age. We currently live in what is called the church age. That will come to an end when the Great Tribulation starts, when the rapture begins. And I'm going to tell you when we get to the rapture why I believe it begins at the very beginning. So we are now living in the church age. The Holy Spirit is here working with us. At the end of the church age, a lot of things happen immediately, and one of them is the Holy Spirit now goes back to how he acted in the Old Testament as an anointer, as a message sender. He is no longer going to be working actively for a small period of time in the future, and we'll talk about that when we get to the rapture. So, during this period, another significant event has also taken place, which is the Jews have been dispersed out of their land. It wasn't until 1948 that we saw the heralds of the approaching fulfillment of this last 7 weeks, or 7 years, The final 7 of Daniel's is what we usually call the Tribulation Period. Now keep in mind, when you talk about the last period of the 7 years, not all of it is tribulation. What is the first 3.5 years? Is it going to be terrible the first 3.5 years? No, it's going to be a time of great peace, which is the reason that whenever the Antichrist comes on scene, and as I said last week, he may very well be here today. He may very well be on scene and coming to a rise in power in Europe. I don't know that, but he very well could be. But what is going to happen is he's going to put in place a peace that is going to be world-renowned. And then something happens after that, and we will talk about that later. So only the Great Tribulation, if you talk about tribulation, it's really just the half or last half of that, and you see that in Matthew as well. Notice that Daniel's prophecy reveals some actions of the Antichrist. First of all, the ruler is to come. That is obviously the Antichrist, and he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, 1 year. However, in the middle of that week, what's going to happen? He's going to set up an abomination that causes desolation in the temple. At the middle point of the Great Tribulation, of that 7-year period, the Antichrist is going to completely stop, and he's going to desecrate the temple that he's allowed the Jews to build to be in peace for the first 3.5 years. At the very middle of that time, he's going to break that. The world is going to just come into the period of time where we talk about the opening of the vials, the sounding of the trumpet. We're talking about the seals being broken on the scrolls. That's when all of that begins, and everything begins to fall apart. I'm going to tell you when we get to Russia, that's when Russia and some of the Arab world is going to come down on Israel, going to come down on the Antichrist. It's going to be completely terrible. The Antichrist also, just to give you a little bit of a preview of what's going to happen, he will die and be risen again, just as Christ, which will make everyone want to follow him. And I'll get into that as we go forward. So if you look at Matthew 24, he calls it the Great Tribulation, which is going to happen. So here you go. The peace treaty with Israel begins on that last 7-year period. Then it breaks the treaty in the middle, and at the very end of it is the Battle of Armageddon. What happens at the Battle of Armageddon? Is the Antichrist finally put to death forever? Anyone know? Want to dare to guess? Is the world destroyed at the Battle of Armageddon? Who said no? 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 How many no's do we have? Raise your hand. I'd like to see. How many no's do we have? Is the world destroyed at the Battle of Armageddon? It's okay. I mean, how many say yes, it is completely destroyed? At this point, it is not. This is where it gets really interesting for me as we go forward, because what you're going to find is there are going to be 144,000 people, specifically of a tribe of Judah, of a tribe that is going to pass through to the millennial reign of Christ. There's also going to be a few others, and when we get to the millennial reign and we get to that point in our study, we will also delve into people being saved, how that's going to happen. It's very complex when we get to talking about this. There's a lot that's going to happen leading up to this. I can't wait to kind of get into that study. We're almost out of time, which is perfect. It's a complex, amazingly detailed, and there's been a lot written about it. So as we go for it, I'm going to give you a few other interpretations. We're going to discuss how some of those may affect our viewpoint. God does have a timetable, though. And what's even more interesting is it's right on track.
Yeah, we can't alter it.
It's right on track. What's scary to me sometimes is the people that we've not reached as Christians, who when that rapture happens, the chances of them turning to Christ after that point is nearly slim to none. Because the Antichrist is going to be so convincing that they're going to fall head over heels for him and what he's saying. You think that I am that there's no way? Just look at the biggest church nearly in Texas is Joel Osteen's. I'm not saying he is a wealth and prosperity preacher, right? You start having someone speak of wealth and prosperity and world peace, people will follow. So he knows the end of the beginning. God does. We're always supposed to be looking, and as Revelation said in 22:7, we need to be ready and prepared for his triumphal re-entry and his second appearing. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Next week, we're going to talk specifically about how the world's going to look in society going forward. There's a few things that Paul says to Timothy. This is exactly the way society is going to look. He's going to compare it to the days of Noah. How bad was it in Noah's day prior to the flood? It was pretty rough. It was pretty rough. Homosexuality was running rampant. Worship of false gods was running rampant. Guess where we're headed, people? Ain't no doubt about that. We got people who want to put up a Satan statue in Little Rock right beside the Ten Commandments. It's coming. So we're going to see how society is going to flow. The next week after that, all goes well. God keeps us here. We're going to talk about the makeup of the nations and how it's going to come in the future. Specifically, the world power, the revived Roman Empire, as what the Bible talks about it going forward, and Russia. Those are the two that we're going to focus on. Okay. Anything else that you want to talk about or ask a question about before we close? Like I said, I know that's a lot of details this morning, but I wanted you to know where we get that final week and how we get to that point and why there's the division of the 3 weeks, 3 smaller units. Come on, some hard questions. Anything. Overall, the lesson boring?
Very interesting.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Okay. I'm thoroughly looking forward to this study. As I told you a couple of weeks ago, it has been 20 years since the last time I taught this, so I'm very excited to teach this again in a new perspective, with a new enthusiasm about it. Okay, if there's no other questions, then we'll bow our heads and we'll dismiss. Well, we got a few minutes. We got coffee to drink. Anything?
One thing I was talking to my aunt about it, when God comes back for his people,
The rapture.
yes, will he sound the trumpets then, or will we just be up in the air with him?
It's sounding of the trumpet, and it's going to be an immediate. It's coincide with each other. Yeah, you're going to meet him in the air with that. So that's very specific in his wording that we meet him in the air. Very specific. Yeah. You wonder what everybody's going to think whenever they're left behind. How many of you watched those series, the Left Behind series, or read the books? Either one. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that's like, I don't know if the Bible ever said that really.
Theatrical.
Yeah, you got to add a little theatrics to it. But those left behind, there are places in the Bible which lead you to believe that people will just dismiss it as if it's a non-occurrence. I don't know how we could all be sitting here and then, somebody, well, where did everybody go? Oh, they must have went to the bathroom. I don't know. I don't know how it's going to happen. You look at, I've often thought like in the cockpit they should have one saved person, one unsaved person. That way if something happens,
Yeah.
Still hasn't been up there.
We got our
Balance.
redundancy.
Think about balance.
That's right, you gotta have a balance.
The church age, there's no specific timeline in the Bible about the church age.
There's 9 specific ages in the Bible that we talk about, and I didn't go into that because I felt like it was a little bit too much, but anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt your question. Why, what now?
Well, is there specific time? Why is there not specific time? I mean, you got specific time for the first 7 weeks, the 62 weeks, and the last week. And
Why did he
and then
not
you got
give that?
Then you get the
That's a great
expanse.
question. Why did he not? God has a timeline for it, and why he didn't let us in on that is because he didn't want us to know. Obviously, he told us in that a moment no one would know would be when the rapture. If he gave us that timeline, we'd know exactly. But he gave us a lot of details. He gave us what society's going to look like. We're going to compare it to Noah. Like I said, he gave us a lot of details about what's coming. And when 1948 happened, that was the catalyst. That's when everybody was like, wow, that should wake me up. And we should start thinking, because if you look, this is a map. I put this on here for just in case we got into it a little bit. When Abraham received the royal grant for all of the land of Israel, this was about the size of it, if you want to look at it. It's pretty large, especially when you consider that Israel now is just this little sliver here coming down the coast. But this was actually all of the grant that was given to Abraham. And this is what's promised. How many times has God gone back on this promise? So then that leads you to say, well, then how is this all going to get back here? He's going to fulfill this promise. This is going to be what he promised Judah and the Jews and Israel, his chosen people. This will be theirs. Pretty interesting. I used this. I was going through all my notes, and I had what do you call those things? Those clear things that you put on and they project on the wall. Transparency. Yeah, there you go. And so I had this from a long time ago. Anyway, okay. Any other question? Good question though. But otherwise, we'd know exactly when we could say, okay, I'm going to wait to be saved and guilty.
Well, and is there something that says in the Bible that there's gonna be a separation? Because it talks about the 70 weeks. Almost you think of it as continuous, but then there's a breakup between the first 60 and the last week.
Why, is there anywhere it talks about it's going to be continuous? Rephrase the question. I must not.
Well, yeah, you would think it's kind of continuous. It doesn't really say.
You would think it was continuous, but
Because the first 69 were continuous, and then it kind of
separates it out. And the reason he doesn't is it because it was a 70-week total period, not because it was continuous. Anytime I say, well, the next 52 weeks, you're going to think of a year, right? But I could say in some 52-week period, we could divide that out into many sections as we wanted to, right? So that's the reason he did it here as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it could be a point of confusion.
It very well could be, which is the reason he divided it out into 3 smaller units. Absolutely. So that we would know specifically. And that division of the church age is very important because the Holy Spirit has a lot of work to do here. I mean, he's working on you and I, right? And there's a whole spirit world that's happening around us that there are angels assigned to nations. A specific angel assigned to the nation of Israel to handle that nation. And there's an angel that is specifically assigned to every nation, and that's biblical. And there's things happening that we aren't aware of in the spiritual world, and then on our spiritual side that the Holy Spirit's working on too. So all of those things are kind of working behind the scenes to get lined up, and when God pulls the trigger, it's going to happen. Okay, let's all dismiss unless we don't have any other questions, comments. Father, I thank you.